Let's step right into the pitch-black night of November 24th, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve. Today we're diving into a true crime investigation so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it literally remains the only completely unsolved commercial skyjacking in American aviation history. We're tracking a man who boarded a passenger plane in a sharp business suit, held it hostage, demanded an absolute fortune, and then vanished into thin air. Seriously, just disappeared. In this explainer, we've got the suspect profiles, the forensic data, and a wild trail of clues. We're going to map out exactly how this played out, who might have actually pulled it off, and why this unbelievable mystery still haunts the FBI to this day.
Okay, so let's get right into how this all started. I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit next to me. Just imagine reading that. Those are the actual chilling words written on a note handed to a 23-year-old flight attendant named Florence Schaffer. She was working Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. The guy who handed it to her? Well, FBI records described him as a white male in his mid-40s, about 6'1", dressed in a standard business suit. He had just boarded the Boeing 727 in Portland, found his aisle seat right at the back of the plane, lit up a cigarette, ordered a bourbon and soda, and just calmly kicked off a terrifying sequence of events. He laid out his demands: $200,000 and 4 parachutes to be ready when they landed at SeaTac Airport. And if they didn't play along, he said he'd detonate the explosive in his briefcase.
So how did the actual night unfold? Let's break down this harrowing timeline. At minute 0, Cooper just looks like any other regular passenger hopping on a quick 30-minute flight from Portland to Seattle. But once those demands drop, everything changes. The pilots are suddenly forced to fly in circles above Seattle for 3.5 agonizing hours. Just think about the tension there. The passengers are totally in the dark. They're told it's just a minor mechanical issue and they need to burn off some fuel. Meanwhile, down on the ground, police and airline staff are in an absolute frenzy, desperately scrambling to gather up this heavy bag of ransom cash and the parachutes. Okay, so eventually they land. Cooper lets the 36 passengers and a couple of crew members off, grabs his money, and orders the pilots to take off again, this time pointing the plane toward Mexico. But hours later, somewhere over the freezing Pacific Northwest, Cooper does the unthinkable. He actually lowers the rear stairs of the 727 and jumps straight out into a howling thunderstorm. And get this, he wasn't wearing survival gear. He leaped into a pitch-black sky, taking 200-mile-an-hour winds right to the face, wearing a trench coat and loafers. Poof, gone.
Now, Cooper was smart, really smart. He was canny enough to snatch his ransom note back, so the FBI couldn't test it. But he wasn't perfect. He left a few things behind: some cigarette butts, a stray hair, and, absolutely crucially, a clip-on necktie he ripped off right before he jumped. And this is where it gets fascinating, because it shows how forensic science can totally blow a cold case wide open. They couldn't pull fingerprints off it, but modern analysis released in 2025 revealed that this tie was literally covered in over 100,000 microscopic particles. And we're not just talking about everyday dust here. They found rare metals, things like bismuth and unalloyed titanium. This is a massive, massive clue. Because what does that tell us? Well, it points far away from some random street criminal and directly towards someone who probably worked in a highly specialized manufacturing facility, quite possibly someone with direct connections to Boeing itself. It gave the Bureau their very first real profile of the man behind the dark sunglasses.
But you're probably wondering, what about the money? Well, for almost a decade, the FBI turned up absolutely zero. Nothing. Until 1980. $5,800. 9 years after the heist, an 8-year-old kid named Brian Ingram was just digging around in the sand on the banks of Washington's Columbia River, and he literally unearths a bundle of rotting, deteriorating $20 bills. When the police ran the numbers, the serial codes were a perfect 100% match to the stash given to D.B. Cooper. Aside from that tie and a few bits of trash on the plane, these decayed, river-soaked bills are the only material evidence from the hijacking that has ever been recovered. It physically proved that at least some of the money made it to the ground, even if Cooper's ultimate fate was still a complete mystery. All right, so let's take those forensic clues and apply them to the FBI's suspect list. Over 800 people were looked at in the first 5 years alone. But let's look at 2 of the absolute most fascinating prime suspects. First up, Richard McCoy Jr. Less than 5 months after Cooper, this guy pulls off a nearly identical skyjacking. He demanded $500,000, parachuted out the back of a 727, and used a fake name. He got caught, convicted, and was actually killed in a shootout after breaking out of prison. But here's the eerie part. In 2023, his kids revealed they found a hidden 1 in a billion parachute rig stashed in a family shed, plus a logbook that might actually place him at the scene. Wild, right? But then, we have Sheridan Peterson. Remember those microscopic rare metals on the tie we just talked about? Well, Peterson was a former Boeing employee who literally worked in the exact department that wrote the flight manual for the Boeing 727. Plus, he was a super experienced skydiver who worked at the very same skydive center that supplied Cooper's parachutes. The technical know-how is a perfect match, although Peterson always swore he was in Nepal at the time. Let's keep playing detective here and check out 2 more heavily investigated figures. On one hand, we have Robert Rackstraw. This guy's resume is basically an action movie. He was a pilot, a former paratrooper, and he had this sprawling criminal history of grand theft and bad checks. He was so incredibly bold that in 1978, he actually faked his own death by radioing in a phony Mayday call from a rented plane. Sound familiar? It's exactly the kind of theatrical, crazy evasion tactic we see in the Cooper case. But then we look at Kenneth Christiansen. Christiansen didn't just understand airplanes, he had a direct, inside connection to the actual airline that got hijacked. He worked for Northwest as both a mechanic and a flight attendant. Oh, and he was also a military paratrooper, and here is the kicker. The very next year after the hijacking, while living on a pretty modest airline salary, the guy suddenly buys a house entirely in cash.
And you know what? The Christiansen connection gets even stranger. Fast forward to 1994, Kenneth Christiansen is on his deathbed. According to his brother Lyle, Kenneth looked right at him and said these exact words, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." Wow, it's just a spine-tingling moment. Was that an actual confession to the greatest unsolved crime in American history, or just the rambling, cryptic last words of an old man? This is exactly why diving into these suspect profiles is so utterly captivating. Every single time the FBI thought they had the perfect fit, there was just enough reasonable doubt. Maybe the eye color was off, or the smoking habits didn't match, or they just lacked that final piece of definitive proof to keep the handcuffs off.
Okay, so here's the really crucial takeaway from all of this. Whether Cooper lived or died out there in the cold, whether he was Cooper, Peterson, Rackstraw, or Christensen, his actions that night fundamentally changed the way every single one of us flies today. It led directly to the invention of the Cooper vane. Because of this one crazy stunt, the Federal Aviation Administration stepped in and mandated that this small external latch had to be installed on all Boeing 727 aircraft. Its one and only job? To prevent those rear stairs from ever being lowered in the middle of a flight again. Think about that. D.B. Cooper didn't just steal $200,000. He permanently altered global aviation manufacturing. He literally left his name on the planes. Which brings us to our final, lingering question. The FBI officially closed its active investigation into D.B. Cooper in 2016, saying they needed to focus their resources on other priorities. And yet, as we've just seen, amateur sleuths and family members are still out there, continuously unearthing new evidence. We're talking hidden parachutes and microscopic titanium fragments. We've got decaying money pulled from the river mud and literal deathbed confessions. So I'll leave you with this thought to chew on. If the Bureau has officially packed up its files, will the true identity of the man in the trench coat forever remain lost to the pitch-black skies, or is the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle still out there, just waiting to be dug up? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.